relating to greening sacred spaces goes back to when I was executive director at Sierra Club of Canada. And even then it was somewhat challenging to be what I call an out-of-the-closet Christian in the work I was doing. You know, you can find lots of great predecessors in the environment movement, early heroes who were, you know, didn't make any bones about faith. And going back to the founder of Sierra Club, John Muir, if you want to read some fire and brimstone stuff by somebody who thinks that dams and human progress are the quite literal works of the devil, you can read some of the John Muir stuff, because he was a serious fire and brimstone eco-screed writer, and pretty good stuff. And then you can read Rachel Carson, and as a scientist, she was very clear on how she reconciled Genesis with science, and she never had any problems, and neither do I, but that's another case altogether. Now that I'm in politics, it requires a whole lot of preparatory context setting, and I still get in trouble because people don't want to know. I mean, the concept of, and I should stop by saying it's great to be here at the New York Cultural Center, and thanks to Mira for inviting us, because this is a multi-faith and multi-ecumenical kind of gathering, and Greening Sacred Spaces always reaches out to all different varieties of religion, and I'm cognizant of that. But when you're in politics, just for a moment, conjure what comes to your mind when you hear that there's a Christian politician. The next words are usually, and you're all going to hell. So you really want to watch out for anyone in politics. Our sense of politics and faith, which is what I'm asked to speak to today, really comes much more from what we see happening in the United States, where it is apparently impossible to imagine that you can run for president of the United States unless you're prepared to be not just a Christian, but a certain kind of Christian. I mean, the idea that Barack Obama might actually be Islamic is somehow a terrible idea. I mean, it to me is craziness in the 21st century that, well, U.S. politics is craziness in all of them. When you dissect it, you wonder what on earth, how did they get to this place? And so you can't, in the United States, aspire to be president without being a Bible-thumping Christian. And in Canada, you can't aspire to be anywhere in politics unless you're very, 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 very far from it and never mention it. So there's something in the middle here that I'd like to find. I recognize the importance of the separation of church and state. I currently don't think that's the challenge facing our society. Our current challenge is to separate oil and state. That is the government future. And it may be the churches can help us do that. And when I say churches writ large, I mean religious communities of all kinds can perhaps help unstick the current assumption that from the moment of our birth, our driving purpose is to increase the GDP. That is it's the breath we draw, must be something that enhances the economy. Anything else is subversive to the national interests. We now have a prime minister who has literally said this, and his cabinet ministers repeat it, that if you want to stop oil tankers from being on the British Columbia coast, if you want to halt the growth of greenhouse gases, if you don't think we should build the Great Pipeline of China across northern British Columbia, you are an enemy of Canada. You are against Canada. This is the language that is now being used, which I find fairly scary. But returning to my topic, for me as someone who couldn't do the work I do without having a grounding in faith, a sense that, you know, given the current context, I don't know how I'd function if I didn't believe miracles were possible. I personally am committed to seeing Stephen Harper out of office this year. I clearly adhere to miracles. I don't think you can wait for another, which I can tell you more about in the discussion section of today's meeting. In other words, when I look at what's happened to our society, there was a time when it was assumed that while we had the separation of church and state, there was a role for the voice of organized religion in a political context. There was a role for the faith community in its many permutations to say out loud and clearly, Poverty is wrong. Well, it's an okay road. We don't hear it whether it's still being said, but it doesn't get the same resonance because there's a modern assumption of a secular society that we are post-religion, and therefore the anachronistic voices of people speaking from a place of moral courage are irrelevant because they don't do a thing for the economy. So you really have to question, what's the purpose of faith or God, and what has God ever done for our economy? Well, it's a good question. So in looking around at things that I think put the current context of our society in sharp relief, I love this old column that I have saved for many years. It was in the Toronto Star on April 26, 2000. It was a column by the last of the left-wing voices of columnists, Dalton Camp, Red Tory. And Dalton Camp wrote a column right after the massacre at Columbine High School. And it was a column relating his experience of watching CNN for the memorial service, an outdoor memorial in Colorado for the slain students and the horrific events that had happened. And this is how it went. They were gathered at Dalton Camp, recounted that the governor of Colorado was reciting Psalm 11. Quote, "In the Lord I put my trust, how say ye to my soul?" And here's Dalton Camp says, "The governor continued, the cameras explored the crowd, grim-faced, some weeping, all somber in bearing. In the lower corner of the screen, CNN was also reporting the market returns from Wall Street. It went like this. For lo, the wicked bend their bow, they make ready their arrow. Dow up 36.8. Upon the string that they may privily shoot. Nasdaq down 87.4. At the upright in heart, if the foundation be destroyed, what can the righteous do? And so on and so on. Amen." Camp wrote, "I may be the only viewer who believes it unsuitable to run stock market quotations on the tube while at the same time televising a community in mourning. There may be a vast majority who believe reading Psalm 11 while reporting on the Dow and the Nasdaq are complementary events whose congruency appears natural to a society that believes in God but worships mammon." End quote. Yeah, you don't see this star stuff in the paper very much. It put me in mind years later, and some of you may have been there. There was a faith and ecology conference at the University of Toronto. And I think it was organized by Stephen Sharper and Ted, unless you organized it. Who organized it? Do you remember that conference where Peter Timmerman spoke?
Yeah, we organized it.
You organized it. There you go. Stephen Sharper was merely at the front near me. So many of you may have been there, so forgive me if I'm repeating something that you've heard before, but I thought it had a certain power and fit the context of what I face on a day-to-day basis so perfectly that it bears repeating. And that was a presentation by active Buddhist and York University environment professor Peter Timmerman. And Peter's presentation was essentially this, and I just mentioned it earlier, 21st century secular society. He said, you know, people think that in Canada we're currently a secular society. And they miss the fact that we actually have an official state religion. It's econotheism. We worship the economy. The worship of the economy has, just as any other religion, a full set of dogma. It has its catechism, it has its priesthood, it has its rituals, it has its required observance of faith. And its central organizing tenet is the elevation as a virtue of selfish individualism. And he said, and all the great religions will tell you that leads straight to doom. So that was what Peter said, and I thought it rather resonated with what Dalton Camp said. We don't often, the notion of mammon is always very vague in Scripture. There's this notion of mammon, and that you can't worship two things at once. Or Sally McFaig said, tell me how you spend your day, and I'll tell you who your God is. there's a very good case to be made that the official state religion is the worship of the economy. I sometimes think that we do better trying to deal with the climate crisis if instead of dealing with it as a scientific issue, which it certainly is, as an economic challenge, which it is, as a technological issue, and by the way, we have all the technology that we need to replace fossil fuels tomorrow. We know all the solutions and we can do it economically, but the issue of the climate crisis tends to be dealt with as environmental, and I really don't think climate change is an environmental issue anymore. It might have been at one time, but it fundamentally is the largest security threat facing human civilization and life on Earth. So it's kind of an environmental issue the way drowning is a water issue. I mean, water is involved, but you really, if you're drowning, you're not thinking, I am dealing with a water crisis now. You're looking at survival. Climate crisis is now about survival. So anyway, you can deal with it as an environmental issue, you can deal with it as an economic issue, you can deal with it as science, you can deal with it as technology. But how often do we deal with it as a fundamentally a moral question? And that's where I think we're on our strongest ground. And that's where communities of faith have the most to say. I think that, and it was not my notion, but I'm indebted for this parallel to Robert Kennedy Jr., who wrote a very strong article, and I think it was in Harper's, at the time that Barack Obama was coming to office, in which he sketched out the similarities between our addiction to oil and our addiction in the past to slavery. Slavery in the United Kingdom, well, in the British Empire and in North America, slavery was a source of energy. Before fossil fuels, it was what did the work. It let some people be really rich, and it let other people be captured, enslaved, deprived of everything they'd ever known and any right they had, die miserably on the slave vessels that went to northern U.S. ports, British slave masters, and so on and so forth. And we know why the hymn Amazing Grace always moves us and always makes me get a catch in my throat, because we know what the story is about. But the slave trade was much, can you imagine trying to defeat the slave trade where you didn't have an argument that if we keep doing this, we'll so pollute the atmosphere that we won't have a future for our children? It was an issue without a technological, scientific, economic, or even environmental aspect. It was entirely a moral question. What right do we have as an economy, as the wealthy British or North American societies, to benefit from the enslavement of fellow human beings to do our work? So Bobby Kennedy Jr. pointed out that we should have an Emancipation Declaration from fossil fuels that's just as strongly rooted in the moral questions as the fight to end slavery was.